Perhaps the FBI was spying on the Trump campaign. And, that's certainly problematic. We're talking about collusion to affect U.S. elections. And what if the FBI was colluding? I mean, the Steele dossier produced and paid for by the Democrat
Democrats.
Party,
Mm.
colluding with Democrats, including the Obama administration, the unmasking, to affect the election. Kim Strassel on Fox on Friday laying it out. All of the stonewalling by justice to turn over documents that the House Intelligence Committee is entitled to see, all the stonewalling over the last year. And why was that? To protect national security? To protect sources?
Well, for months now, look at how they handled that initial subpoena. They simply ignored it, and then they delayed. And remember all of the excuses. This could harm national security. This could undermine our relationship with intelligence partners. What we have seen so far show that none of that's the case. What they were actually hiding were revelations that were hugely embarrassing to the FBI. For instance, the fact that it didn't fully inform the FISA court about the fact that it was basing its surveillance warrant on information that came from the rival presidential campaign.
And on the prospect of spying on the Trump campaign?
Well, at least interacting with the Trump campaign. What we know from a leak that appears to have come from law enforcement is that they're requesting information about a source. And that term is important because when the FBI talks about a source, they talk about someone that's your average citizen that uses their credentials or their job as a way of spying for the agency. So we can take that to mean that this is somebody that was interacting with the Trump campaign in some way and reporting back to the FBI, which means the FBI was using human intelligence to spy on a presidential campaign.
So, in summary?
We had the Obama administration unmasking. We now know that there was a surveillance warrants against members of the Trump campaign. We now believe, based on this, that they potentially had human people spying on that. I mean, this is pretty amazing and outrageous stuff, especially this is a political environment. Law enforcement is supposed to tread very carefully so that they don't look like they are in any way influencing or getting involved in an election.
For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by our friend Rich Lowry, the editor of National Review, Fox News contributor, and author of the book Lincoln Unbound. He's got a new piece up at National Review on Trump, which we'll get to momentarily. But Rich, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So in addition to Kim Strassel, the other person who's, I think, written most persuasively and insightfully on this entire topic of the Mueller probe is your colleague Andy McCarthy at National Review. But what about what Strassel wrote last week in the Journal and what she's saying on Fox News there about the prospect of the FBI and perhaps in conjunction with Obama administration officials or Democrat operatives spying on the Trump campaign during the Trump campaign for the purposes ostensibly of derailing it or at least as a fail-safe should it somehow unlikely become successful as it was?
Well, I think there's much more we need to learn here. And one of the tropes of the other side when they talk about Donald Trump is that he's acting guilty. Well, you can turn it around and say the FBI and the Justice Department have been acting guilty for more than a year, for a year or more, not giving up these documents to an oversight committee for which, they ultimately work in the sense that this is where they get their funding. And it's been bizarre that you've had a Republican-controlled Justice Department stonewalling a Republican-controlled committee. So it's very odd. My hat's off to Kimberly Strassel, to Andy McCarthy, who you kindly mentioned, and also Byron York at the Washington Examiner, who's been all over this. And I don't think we have enough to draw conclusions yet, but with every rock that's overturned, there are at least more questions.
What about the suggestion that's been made by some, including Andy McCarthy, Trump should intervene and declassify everything and lay it bare for the public to see?
I think that's absolutely right. And one of the strange things about this whole experience is that the president oftentimes seems as though he has no control over his own executive branch, including the Department of Justice. He could declassify all this with a stroke of the pen and end the contention between the House committee and his own Justice Department and do the public a service by revealing all this information so we can see and draw whatever the appropriate conclusions are. So I think the reason that he's not doing that is, one, he fears, or at least people around him fear, that anything he does having to do with the Justice Department will add to an alleged obstruction of justice case. And two, a lot of people around him are just cautious. And three, a lot of people around him just might not know how all this works. But it's really strange to have the president have to kind of threaten, the way he did on Fox and Friends a week or two ago, that he's going to order his Justice Department to do things that he has the complete lawful authority to order them to do. It shouldn't be a threat. If he thinks it's an important priority, he should tell them to do it. And if they don't, fire them and do it himself.
Well, hypothetically speaking, what are the FBI and Justice Department? What are they hiding, or what do you think they are?
Well, it would be what we were just discussing, whether there was kind of an effort from the beginning to kind of entrap the Trump campaign to have an insurance policy, quote unquote, of an investigation that would be going from the beginning and that would hobble the administration. So that would be the darkest fear.
And most recent piece you penned for National Review, Donald Trump, man of his word. You make the point that Trump hasn't kept all of his promises. For example, he didn't drop Bo Bergdahl out of an airplane over Afghanistan with no parachute. So that's probably a promise he shouldn't have kept. But it is sort of interesting, right? For conservatives, when Trump burst on the scene in 2015 into 16, there was so much that he had changed from previous pronouncements over his many decades in the public eye, in addition to curiosities about his behavior consistent with what he was saying as a presidential candidate. You didn't know what to believe, but it turns out that Trump has been more of a man of his word on campaign promises than not.
Yeah, now I was one of those who was very skeptical, because he would just seem willing to say anything in front of any audience at any time. And we've seen a little bit of that when he's president. Obviously, these televised congressional meetings he had about immigration and gun policy was sort of all over the map. But on his core promises having to do with immigration, taxes, Obamacare, judges, pulling out of the Iran deal, he has been determined to deliver. And I think that's to his great credit. He has gone where I think other Republicans would have feared to tread. I think we would have had, I forget what everyone said during the campaign, but probably every Republican candidate in the primary said they were going to get out of the Iran deal. But I'm not sure any of them would have, except for Donald Trump, because he's willing to go right directly in the face of polite opinion, as exemplified by the New York Times op-ed page and pundits on TV and European powers. So I think that is all to his credit. And he obviously he'll make things up. He'll tweet whatever he wants and depending on his mood at a given moment. So in that sense, he's not particularly a man of the word. But when it comes to these core promises, he knows he told his voters he was going to do it, and he wants to deliver. And it drives him crazy that he hasn't been able to deliver more on the border, which was a source of that blow up he had with his Secretary of Homeland Security in the cabinet meeting.
Yeah, so you don't think that was rumor that really happened?
Oh, it really happened. My understanding was from people in the room, it was one of the most uncomfortable things they'd ever seen, because he is like, I want the border closed. And she's like, it's complicated. It's like, no, you don't understand. I want the border closed. And everyone's sort of thinking, can she just, stop arguing with him about this? So it's something he's really determined to do. And this is where he's had the most difficulty delivering on his promises, is where it involves Congress, because it just inherently gets more complicated. You have to get the votes, and they're not always there, as we saw with Obamacare repeal. But on the things he can do on his own, he has completely done them, whether it's judges pulling out of the Paris Accords, pulling out of the Iran deal today, opening the embassy in Jerusalem, a promise that the last three presidents have made in some form or other. It's really extraordinary. And again, I think really speaks to his fortitude.
Well, and fortitude is the operative word, because, with the violence that has broken out, I think the last report, 37 dead and 1,500 injured in protests in Gaza over the U.S. Embassy opening in Jerusalem. He's going to take heat from the D.C. press corps for the violence, that this is, blood on his hands and so forth. and he's a guy that once he makes a decision, he's willing to lean in and put in the fight for the decision he made and stick with it. Whereas you've seen, and maybe this sort of explains the rise of Trump in part, you see a lot of Republicans when they get really full frontal from the D.C. press corps, they're on their heels.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He is fearless when it comes to what the press is going to say to him. Now, about him. Now, it's a little paradoxical because I don't think any president has ever cared more about what's said about him on TV, in the sense that he just consumes this stuff all the time, and it very often drives him crazy. But usually when someone cares a lot, what's being said about him on the mainstream outlets, that's a sign of weakness, and that's a sign they're going to waver, and it's a sign they're going to back down. He cares about it a lot and doesn't back down at all. In fact, doubles down. And it's terrible that we're seeing that violence in Gaza, but the unfortunate fact is Palestinians riot all the time, and Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the Israeli nation, and if they can't handle us recognizing that, that's all on them, not on us.
David Brooks over at New York Times said over the weekend that, admitting, I think begrudgingly, to Trump's success in putting us in a better position with North Korea, he had certainly ambivalent feelings about pulling out of the Iran deal, but did note that the promises that were predicated on the deal from the Obama administrations clearly did not materialize. But he said something interesting. He said, Trump's a bit of a thug, and so perhaps he deals better with thugs than people with higher IQs. Kind of statement that you would expect from David Brooks. But what about that? I mean, Trump's sort of pugnacious personality, he likes the blood sport of interactions, whether business or politics, maybe serving the country well in the foreign policy arena.
Yeah, so look, I mean, this isn't a fresh insight, but Trump has kind of the instincts of the bully on the school bus, and he knows everyone's weaknesses and knows what buttons to push and who he can shove around. And he's taken that sensibility, which worked very well for him in the Republican primaries, diminishing and beating all those candidates, to the international stage. And in part, I don't think this is entirely what's going on, but in part, he pushed Kim Jong-un's buttons and rattled him and scared him. And I think that's a very good thing. Now, the other part of what's going on here probably, and we'll see how it goes, is that Kim is pursuing the usual North Korean strategy. This is what they've done for decades. They advance their nuclear and missile program, and at some point the sanctions kind of bite, and they realize they can't take it anymore, they need some relief, and then they promise to stop. And then they cheat, and they get the economic benefits, and then on it goes. So I'm skeptical, because as a conservative, I think the past is the best guide to the future. So I think Kim is probably going to try to do that again, but there's some chance that there is something different going on here, and if there is, it's going to redound to Trump's benefit.
He is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review, nationalreview.com, Fox News contributor, author of the book Lincoln Unbound. We'd love to get a copy of Lincoln Unbound for the Lincoln Library in Springfield, Rich, but right now they have to sell the stovepipe hat of Lincoln to keep the doors open. So that'll have to wait. Rich, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.